Now, this is the most examined relationship in film history, isn't this? Tippi Hedren and Alfred Hitchcock. What preconceptions did you have about it before you began exploring it yourself?
Oh gosh, that's a good question. I don't think I knew anything about it really, apart from just that there was this guy who liked to put blondes in his films, and there was a girl who was in 2 of his films who got into trouble with him. I don't think I knew anything more about it than that. And I should say that, probably like everybody in the room, I'm a huge Alfred Hitchcock fan. I love a good English genius, hence the Jane Austen, Charles Dickens thing. It's all part of the same obsession, to use an overused word tonight, with me. So I loved his films, I loved the whole blonde thing, and I was aware that there was some reality in it, but it wasn't until I got the call asking me to do, which I said yes to immediately, as you can imagine. Want to write a film about Alfred Hitchcock and Tippi Hedren? No. And then I went into it and learnt more about it, but I don't suppose you knew much more about it than that, really, either.
What did you know, Julian?
The same. I mean, when I read the script, I was shocked, I suppose. But I think it's sort of, I found it very illuminating because there's so many strange personal sort of demons in Marnie and Vertigo in particular that I think this, what Gwyneth's script talked to, and the fact that Tippi has now recently been very open about what actually happened, sort of allowed us, to explore this world.
This is something of a change, isn't it? Because it would have been impossible to make, I guess, 20 years ago, at least impossible to make without Tippi Hedren's blessing or involvement, I'd suggest.
Well, people do make films about true stories without the blessing or involvement of the participants, but I would never do that. I mean, I don't know how you do that, actually, because, well, how do you know what to put in the film unless you've spoken to the participants? So the film only came about really because Tippi chose to speak to Donald Spoto for his book. They were really old friends, and she chose finally to break her silence. She's a very proud woman. I mean, I don't know how many of you were there earlier this evening. She's extremely proud. She's a very upright, proud, strong woman, and she was full of conflicted feelings about it herself. And having spoken to Donald about it, she then began to feel more able to talk to other people, and very happily for us, I went to see her and she talked to me. So I did my own interviews with her, and very interesting they were.
So what were those conversations like? I mean, was she telling things to you that she hadn't told to anybody before?
That's hard to say. My approach when I'm doing these interviews, it's not really like other forms of journalism, if you like. You're not just looking for a quote to write down, although I did write down everything she said, typed it up very quickly. You're really looking for situations that you can dramatise, that you can put on the screen. And so you want to know exactly how did you feel at that point, and can you remember what you said? Or if you can't remember what you said, would you like to think about what you'd like to have said? So that you can get a real good picture of who that person was at that time. And that's quite difficult because, it's a long time ago and we all like to imagine that we were different then. And so it was a big journey for her as well, I think. We did a lot of head-banging over cups of tea and trying to reach back into the past and really remember properly what she felt.
So what did she discover about it, do you think, through this process, if she told you? Yeah.
Let's think. I think she began to think that how interesting it would have been if she'd been that much younger and it happened now. She's got this great line now, if it happened now, I'd be a rich woman. Because it wasn't really clear to any of us when we started that the whole concept of sexual harassment did not exist. And if the words don't exist in a sort of funny sort of way, the thing doesn't exist. And her own silence at that time and her own the silencing of a strong woman in that situation. A professional woman, 32 with a child, a single mother. She was not a dope, she was not a victim, she was not a little girl. And for a woman as powerful and adult as she was to find this situation impossible to deal with, I think looking back, she realised quite how, through modern eyes, that seems really extraordinary. And it was one worry for us, wasn't it, when we were doing the film, would that silence, would that fear that she felt be understandable to a modern audience 50 years later, where we're all so used to this stuff, we talk about this stuff all the time, it's women's magazine material. We don't put up with sexual harassment, do we, girls? But she did, and she had to, and in the end, I was worried that people wouldn't understand it or wouldn't understand her, and So it was really useful to discover in talking to her about it, things like that the only person she went to was Peggy Robertson, in the scene where she asked Peggy Robertson, the long-suffering assistant, for help, and Peggy refused her. That was real, and it was at that point that Tippi, in real life, realised that there was no help for her. She had to put up with it on her own, that the other women did not support her. And, we'd like to think that wouldn't happen now.
And she's keen to, when she's asked about it, she's keen to emphasise, which is only a small part of the film, but the sort of good times before the car scene. When she had the greatest acting tuition in the whole world. She was in the glamour of Hollywood. She had costumes. She had everything she could want, and who wouldn't be seduced? And they had this very strong bond between Alma and Hitchcock. He felt he was like a father to her. Alma was, a dear friend. So that's why, in a way, that it took quite a long time for her to come out against it, I think.
Another thing that she emphasises as well is that the story is sort of a product of a very particular historical moment when the studio system is winding down. And really, in kind of the previous Hollywood period, actually, this sort of behaviour would have been fairly standard, wouldn't it? The casting couch was sort of an acceptable part of Hollywood daily business at a certain level.
Yeah, although the complexity of this story is it wasn't just that, as it's pointed out in the film. Hitchcock's obsession is a very peculiar kind of romanticism that isn't necessarily sexual, but is just as difficult to deal with. But yes, and it was also coming at a historical point when Hitchcock's style of filmmaking, where everything was done in the studio, it was very controlled, was moving into the sort of new wave in Hollywood where people went out on location with handheld cameras and there was more realism and the actors were given more freedom. So it's also the beginning of the end of that era, really. And so the sort of destruction of their relationship also points to the destruction of that Hitchcock style, really.
And I suppose, he's not the only director to have employed these sort of shock tactics upon his cast. I mean, Ken Loach has set dogs on unsuspecting cast members. William Friedkin famously kind of fired guns off near the heads of unsuspecting actors. I mean, as a director,
unlike me.
I mean, is the relationship between Hitchcock and Hedren just a sort of amplified version of the relationship between a lot of directors and actors?
I mean, it's interesting because in one of the biographies, it does explain away this relationship in terms of he was using shock tactics, and there's no doubt he teased and he provoked and all that. But I think as the relationship got more intense, I think it went away. It wasn't just that, and that might have been a justification in his own mind or a way of dealing with it. But I mean, obviously, in the bird sequence, that was definitely, that was definitely in his mind, I think, and not at all like myself and Sienna when we shot the scene ourselves.
Well, what are the implications for you? I mean, does the fact that this is a story of a director abusing a star mean that you had to handle Sienna Miller as delicately as you possibly could?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, I have to say, when we were shooting the bird sequence, which Gwyn very kindly put the bird's attack on one scene. And
yeah, I went home.
I had a nervous breakdown for many weeks trying to figure out how to do it. And obviously, we had a certain small number of birds on our budget, and the only way to do it really was to put the nets in as close as possible to Sienna. And we tried with the pigeons and then the seagulls, and the seagulls fell asleep. And the birds have breaks, by the way, everybody. Yeah. The actors didn't.
What do they do during their breaks?
They have to recuperate and be fed and things.
Okay. They don't smoke and bitch about the coast of the cast, do they?
Probably. But the only way to do it in the end, actually, and like Hitchcock, I got lots of rubbish for many, many takes. And our problem was we had to shoot it in one day. But so the only way really to do it was just to keep rolling and not cut, and get the bird handlers to keep throwing in birds and keep encouraging Sienna to to keep going. And I did at that point feel a little bit like Hitchcock, and I was sort of biting my fingers not to say cuss as she was sprawling around on the floor with pigeons on her. So yeah, that was quite an interesting moment.
I must say, I originally wrote a Fade to Black. I thought we would never be able to stage it. We couldn't afford it. We wouldn't be able to deal with the birds. It would just be impossible. So I just went sort of, she opens the door. There's a flurry of wings, and a big noise. Fade to black. 5 days later, And we went along with that for a while, didn't we? HBO said, sorry, it's not going to happen. So then I wrote, don't fade to black, just birds attack. It's quite different. I mean, it's not, you can't write that dramatically. You can't write what things for the birds to do. So, yeah, I was on the set at that point, but I left in case it all went wrong.
Well, it did in many things, yeah. And the other peculiar thing as a director, actually, was having... Toby's, when he was... And he had... We should say, he did an incredible job because he had 4.5 hours prosthetics makeup every single morning. And he came on set as Hitchcock, and I was treated as probably an assistant director when I, gently asked him if he'd do something, and he'd kind of nod at me.
Are you saying that the ghost of Hitchcock was possessing him?
Definitely. And but the peculiar thing is, so we had a fake crew doing what Hitchcock was saying, and the real crew doing what I was saying. So Hitchcock was out cut. The cameraman didn't cut, but the clapper loader might walk into shot, and so we all got very confused trying to figure that out.
Gwyneth, you're a journalist by training. There is a kind of a Tippi Hedren version of this story, but was it important to you to make this not a kind of a single source story, to have somebody to corroborate her version, or perhaps resist it?
It became more and more important to me. It probably didn't occur to me to begin with how important it was. There's a certain amount of corroboration in the literature. For instance, Francois Truffaut, probably lots of people here know, Truffaut conducted a huge bunch of interviews with Hitchcock during the film, during post-production of The Birds, and they had an extremely short conversation about this. I don't think Truffaut quite understood what was going on. It was all done through translator, and he must have got home and gone, oh, I've only got a page of this fantastic material. But Hitch did confess his emotional sort of state a bit to Truffaut. So there was a bit of that and the odd sort of comment. But I was very keen to try and, in journalistic terms, stand the story up. And we found 2 people to do that. And they were both depicted in the film. One was the wardrobe mistress, Rita Riggs, who is still alive and amazing, and I went to see her in Los Angeles. And the other, much more importantly, was the young assistant director, Jim, played by Carl Bukes in the film. I went to see Jim Brown. He hadn't given a proper interview about this to anybody, and it's not my brilliant journalism, I assure you. But Jim was nearing the end of his life. He had lung cancer. When I went to see him, he died 3 months later, and he had always felt terribly guilty about his failure to protect Tippi better. They were good mates. They had children the same age and used to play together and so on. And Jim, after several large glasses of Chardonnay and a lot of prompting by his wife, who was from Newcastle upon Tyne and was thrilled to meet me, just one night told me his version, and his version entirely supported Tippi's and was also full of just much more fantastic insights into Hitch, because the big scene where Hitch and Jim get drunk together and he drives him home, that is absolutely, I promise you, word for word from my notebook of my conversation with Jim Brown about that night. And Jim was at that time probably the closest person to Hitch on the planet. They were like father and son, terribly close. And Jim had to watch his mentor and his genius friend self-destruct before his eyes, and the drinking got worse, the morbid eating got worse, and Jim, a very young man, felt incapable of helping his beloved Hitch and equally incapable of helping Tippi. And out of that couple of days I spent in Northern California with him, really, that's as big a foundation for this film as my interviews with Tippi were. And it was funny, actually, because it wasn't until I drove away into the rain, it was exactly like Psycho. And I thought, oh my God, if that hadn't worked, if I hadn't have found him, if we hadn't had this interview, this film would be, well, not nothing, but, as you say, single source. It would be open to, well, it probably is still open to lots of criticism, but I feel on such solid ground about the content of it because of my conversations with Jim Brown.
So, Julian, tell us about the creation of Hitchcock himself and the work that you did with with Toby Jones to kind of bring this man back to life. The walk, that's certainly there, isn't it?
Yes, well, that's all Toby. I mean, he was obviously very sort of daunted by it because he's about the same height as Hitchcock, actually, 5'5" or 5'6", but obviously girth-wise, that had to be dealt with. So he had a fat suit, and then there was this sort of issue of does an audience, because there have been films like Frost Nixon where people don't worry too much about looking like Frost Nixon, and yet Hitchcock is such an iconic character. It didn't feel right that it wasn't a pretty close approximation. And once you start down that route, it's very difficult to stop. And we were lucky in having some very good prosthetics people, both here and in South Africa. And nobody knew, we thought it would be half an hour, and then it was 4.5 hours every day, actually, which was...
But you knew, really.
But what kind of discussions did you both have about Toby Jones, about Hitchcock's motivation, the great enigma of this, the thing that Tippi Hedren will say that she doesn't really know about? Well,
I think there is a complete mystery and contradiction in Hitchcock, which I think Toby embraced. I mean, he's definitely this idea that Hitchcock was very into the aesthetics of the world, whether he was in design or costumes or whatever, and that was something which ties into his notion of beauty and this. I mean, my take on it was this. He came from almost a Victorian background, and that he had this somewhere, which I think we discussed, this sort of almost courtly notion of a Victorian romanticism that wasn't with a sort of repressed sexually as well, and. He'd had a strange childhood. His Alma, as it points out in the film, is his one and only kind of partner. And there's underneath it, because the danger was with it that which Toby was keen not to, that he could just be a monster, and that it could be played like that. And hopefully that you do see this sort of deep well of both insecurities and vulnerabilities, and this sort of romantic quality. I mean, that was part of the reason I used the Wagner later on in the film, which and because the other film that I think was a touchstone was Vertigo, in that many of the plot elements of Vertigo strangely anticipate this story.
Because that strange process of a replication of a person.
Yes, and Vertigo, of course, was made before this happened. So it's almost... and what James Stewart goes through is very much what Hitchcock is doing in this film. So it almost was waiting to happen, it feels to me, that the right person was coming along, that he could mould, that he could take from scratch, that didn't know the business, or he thought he could mould anyway, and he found out he couldn't. But it's that morbid sort of obsessive quality that James Stewart had, I think, is a very, very close parallel to this.
I asked Jim Brown what he thought was going on, and he said he was a simple, great American guy, and he said, I thought he was in love with her. And I think there's a simple explanation. Real life is very difficult, isn't it? Doing real life in the movies is difficult because in stories, everything's quite simple, beginning, middle, end, not necessarily in that order and everything, but in real life, it's always very complicated. And I think Jim was right, and I think you're right. And I have this kind of feeling that he wanted to be, as she says in the film, that it wasn't so much that he wanted to sort of have her, but he wanted to be her. He wanted to be that beautiful, to be that amazing, to almost, to get close to a goddess. So that was, all of these things are true, and they come together in different ways in each of us had different takes on it, really. So we had to play it.
And that's what's so rich about the character in a way, that he's ultimately slightly unknowable. Us normal people can't quite grasp what's going inside his head, and it also made those, which not only in Vertigo but many of his films, are these peculiarities sort of came through and make them so unique, I think.